Andrew Secker, a partner at Mills Reeve, and today I am joined by Laura Burton, a director at BDO and an expatriate tax specialist, which I struggled to say on the pre-recording. Laura, thanks very much for coming in. One of the things that has struck me as we're coming out of the pandemic is that the pandemic has actually made the world feel quite small. We've kind of, for many of us, sort of travel has been this luxury that we once knew and couldn't quite get to it. So really interested in hearing what you're seeing in the world of expatriate tax and the type of issues that you're currently working with employers on.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to be here, Andrew. And you're absolutely right. The pandemic has changed everybody's working world unrecognisably over the last 18 months. And as expat advisors, we did see that everybody stopped moving overnight. But there was a lot of work for us to do around that as well, because there were people who were in country for longer than we were originally expecting, so that we needed to do advice around that. There were people that needed to move quite quickly overnight to get back to families, so that they could spend time at home. But yeah, what we have definitely seen is a bit of a shift more recently to the advice that we're providing, so that it's focused a lot more at the minute around international remote workers.
Yeah.
And obviously what we mean by remote workers in that instance is individuals who are working typically from a home office, but from another country that isn't their normal place of work. And within our field, what we're seeing is foreign nationals who have been living and working in the UK for quite some time, but with the advent of home working and the agility that we're now all experiencing and enjoying, that they're taking the opportunity to move back home and work from home office closer to family and friends.
Well, that really resonates with some of the things I'm seeing a lot, because I've had a few occasions over the last 6-7 months where employers have rung up and said, we've got a slight problem here because X turns out they went to Y, because for some people during the pandemic, rather than living where they work, they reverted to living where they family was or where they were closely connected to deeper friendships, relationships. So you had a bunch of people turning up in all sorts of jurisdictions that no one had an idea of. And people start with thinking, well, okay, that's an employment law issue. And actually, from my perspective, whilst it can be, the two issues on the top of my radar are actually right to work, but more importantly, tax. So I'm really interested in hearing, is that something you're seeing? If so, what are the sort of problems or consequences or unintended consequences that employers need to be alive to?
Yeah, absolutely. And what we would always look at is obviously across the taxes. So I'm a specialist in income tax and social security, and would obviously have to look and see, has the individual generated a liability to those taxes? But we also need to think more broadly around whether the individual's triggered a permanent establishment for corporate tax purposes, and also, are there any VAT implications? So yeah, certainly very much a tax issue when we have these cases.
And where do the real pinch points come? So, is there any examples you could give where these things have come out of the woodwork and it's caused a rather significant unexpected problem?
Yeah, so I think that there's a bit of a notion within the working world, and especially within international business, that if people are below a certain number of days in country, then there isn't anything to worry about. And that's driven by the 183-day test that many people talk about. And
just pause there. Can you help us and say, for those of us that aren't experts on expatriate tax, what is the 183 test?
So I think if we take it back to first principles, the actual taxation position is always that you pay tax in the location in which you're working.
Okay.
So that is first principles, and that kicks in from day one. So the moment that you step foot overseas, then you should be thinking about, do I need to pay income tax and social security? Now, countries around the world recognise that that's a quite complex situation and would create a lot of administration, especially where we have short-term business visitors who are just tripping in for 1 day, 2 days at a time. And so there are double tax treaties in place globally, which set criteria whereby if individuals meet a certain set of rules, then they can claim exemption from income tax. And then there's a separate set of rules around social security, but generally to try and make international travel work without being too burdensome. But the rules aren't easy, and the 183 day point is just one factor in a very complex set of rules.
So where that doesn't apply, you perhaps see some issues where there's different taxation rates, or so there actually can be quite a significant cost if you get this wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, one of the most tricky situations that employees can see themselves in is individuals who do trigger an overseas liability in the host location, but also remain resident in their home country too. And therefore you've got taxation considerations in both locations, which can be relieved through double tax credits, but often there is a higher rate of tax between the two. And where it can become very costly is if you get this wrong and a jurisdiction imposes penalties, that can sometimes be multiples of that, and therefore the numbers can soon stack up. Multiply that across a workforce, if you've got a number of individuals, then it can become quite large numbers quite quickly.
Now, I think it's really interesting to hear this, because a lot of employers I'm talking to at the moment are trying to build their mobility strategy, and many are embracing the massive benefits that we've seen in terms of the way businesses recognise remote working can provide flexibility, perhaps to help any diversity and inclusion agendas in their organisations, to provide better work-life balance, address some of the consequences of growth and mental wealth issues, but also to look at the skills gap that we perennially have had in the UK. Where can we find the best talent to do? And it's sort of helping shift a mindset. But what I'm seeing is sort of a two-pronged strategy in terms of the mobility, which is on the one hand what I call the fully remote, which is that it's a job, it doesn't matter where it's performed, and therefore employers are looking at what happens if I'm content with this job, or maybe nominally in the UK, but I don't mind if it's Kuala Lumpur, South Africa, anywhere in the world, other countries permitted. Or the second aspect is short-term flexibility, to try and meet demands that a number of people seem to have for short-term flexibility to work overseas, to travel, to see friends. How are you helping employers build those sort of mobility strategies?
Yeah, and it's an incredibly interesting time, isn't it? And I think, as you say, it's a great opportunity for the world of business, and that acceleration to home working that happened overnight. And I think the trust and recognition now that people can perform the role very effectively from home. I think it's imperative that businesses are considering their talent strategy around this. And I think it's really interesting that you made the point around there's different types of remote working. So those remote working that you want to offer to attract and retain the best talent, and we've all heard of businesses who've said you can all work anywhere you like, which they must be getting a lot of advice. But I think what's really important is to have policies in place around this, because whilst the things that we've spoken about that need to be considered are absolutely there, we'd never want the tax tail to wag the corporate dog, one of my favourite terms. And it's about making sure that you have the right rigour and governance around this. So having a policy that your HR teams understand, know that if someone requests, can I go and work from the south of Spain for 6 weeks, if the company have looked into the obligations around that and satisfy themselves that that's okay, then you can authorise that. If somebody's asking for something more long term, then there might need to be some cost benefit analysis undertaken to understand, do we want to go down the path of registering, operating payroll in that location, etc. But I think that skills gap point, I think, is a really, really interesting one, and I do see that as mobility advisors, we're likely to spend a lot more time helping organisations around that point and coming up with a bit of a structure for them to say, okay, if you want to hire people in that location, this is what you need to do it in a compliant way. But if you can fill your skills gap by doing that, then it's absolutely all things that can be overcome. What we don't want organisations to do is go ahead without considering all the risks and compliance matters, and like I say, end up in a situation later down the line of penalties, interest being imposed,
Yeah.
being out of time for claiming credits in other places. So all eminently doable. It's just something that needs to be properly thought through.
I completely see that. I've got clients at the moment that are looking at, okay, what mobility do they allow, what rules do they set, and I was only talking to one yesterday where they were talking about having a rule that they operate in a number of jurisdictions, and they say, okay, rule number one is we might allow flexibility in those jurisdictions where we already have payroll, so it's those types of things I think employers need to start getting their head around, because you're right, even when I look at the employment law consequences of employees indifference, it's a case of doing a proper cost risk analysis and getting it right from the outset, rather than making it up when you find someone who's working overseas.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on